First of all, welcome to this webinar entitled 5LD03, a support webinar for learners and centres. The webinar is one of a series of webinars designed to support the units of the CIPD suite of qualifications. This webinar is for people with an interest in learning and development and who are working towards the Associate Diploma in Organisational Learning and Development, or for those who are supporting learners working towards this qualification. The webinar is a set of three webinars designed to support the specialist pathway units of the Associate Diploma in OLD, Organisational Learning and Development. The three specialist units are 5LD01, Supporting Formal and Self-Directed Learning, 5LD02, Design Learning and Development Programs to Create Value, and 5LD03, Facilitate Structured Learning and Development Activities for Groups. In this case, you are looking at the webinar for 5LD03. So let's begin by looking at what that unit involves. 5LD03 looks at the highly skilled and also very interesting activity of facilitating structured learning and development activities for groups. It considers that prime essential skill of managing, to an extent, but definitely enabling, learning to take place in a group context. It considers the skills involved in facilitation, not just during facilitation, where they're at their highest, but also before and after facilitation. And it should be noted that whilst other units consider more about online facilitation, this unit, whilst looking at facilitation in very general terms, does have a focus on that essential skill of being able to facilitate learning in a face-to-face, in-person context. This is an essential skill for L&D professionals, and so there is a focus on this in the unit. Because the assessment briefs are updated regularly, it's really important that you're working with the correct assessment brief. The briefs are written so that they enable learners to meet all the assessment criteria of the relevant unit. The brief you should be working with is shown here. This is the front page of the current assessment brief. And you can check it is the current one by checking that assessment ID there, you can see. And the assessment ID here is 5LD03-2401, meaning it is the first assessment brief issued in 2024, the first assessment brief for this unit. At the bottom of that front page, there are a couple of other important notes. There are 3 bullet points there. The first one confirms that this brief was released in June 2024, and therefore, second bullet point, that the brief will expire in June 2026. And the third bullet point, states, most importantly, that the last moderation window for assignments done against this assessment brief is September 2026. That's the last moderation window relating to this assessment brief. So what's in this assessment brief? All assessment briefs are composed of a number of tasks, usually 1, 2 or 3 tasks, sometimes more. The assessment briefs for the 3 specialist L&D units all follow the same pattern in that they have 2 tasks. Task 1 will always seek to assess your knowledge and understanding of whatever subject the unit is about, while Task 2 aims to assess your application of that knowledge and understanding. So in this particular brief, Task 1 is about your detailed knowledge and understanding of facilitating learning and development, and doing that in a way that is inclusive and meets objectives. Task 2, on the other hand, requires you to apply that knowledge and understanding to the actual facilitation of a learning and development activity, so a practical activity. With any assessment brief, we would strongly recommend that you read the whole brief and get the big picture of requirements before you start working. And this is particularly important here, as Task 2, as you can see, might require significant advanced planning. We have provided some guidance on this planning in the second half of this webinar and also in other documents provided to your centre. So that's the overall requirement, but let's now move on to look in depth at Task 1. Task 1. Task 1 is the knowledge task, and it is really about questions and responding to questions. So the instruction here is that to complete this task, you should provide a written response to 8 questions. So the brief provides 8 set questions for you to respond to. And as it says there, you have approximately 2,800 words in which to respond to all 8 questions. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to apportion those words equally. Some of the questions might require a longer response than others, so think about them before you start. Look over the questions, decide how you want to respond to them. You might get an idea of where you're going to do a longer response and where you're going to perhaps do a more brief response. What you really want to avoid is getting to question 6 and finding you've used all your words up. So think about how you're going to respond to those 8 questions before you start. You should also note that at this level, it is important that you make appropriate use of wider reading to expand your responses and illustrate key points in your answer. So we are at associate level, and therefore it is a requirement that you reference your wider reading. There are 1 or 2 assessment criteria, particularly in the learning and development qualification, because it is a very practical role. There are 1 or 2 assessment criteria where you do not need to provide evidence of wider reading, but these are exceptions. And for most of the questions, you do need to include that referencing. We said that there are 8 questions in Task 1, and we're now going to look at the first of these. Question 1, discuss 3 factors you might consider when preparing to facilitate group-based learning and development activities. Your response should cover 1 of each of the types below. So before we get into those 3 types, let's just think about this question. And really the question is recognizing that facilitation doesn't just start at the point where you actually facilitate. Effective facilitation requires a certain amount of preparation. And so it focuses on here on preparation in relation to 3 different areas. Hence the statement there that your response should cover 1 of each type below. So the first area of preparation you're asked to consider is preparing your learners. So you're asked to discuss 1 factor relating to preparing the learners. So you might think there about, are they aware? Are they in agreement? How will you engage them? Do you need to think about pre-learning? So they're just some examples, things you might consider in relation to your learners prior to your facilitation. Whichever factor you choose in that category, you then need to discuss it. So you might, for example, talk about why you think it's important, how you would consider it, how would you prepare for that factor. So bring that factor to life and discuss it. You then need to consider a factor in relation to the physical space to be used. And we're looking here at the physical space in terms of in-person learning. So we're looking at the room, the environment, the physical space that's being used for the facilitation. So your factor, you could relate to something like health and safety. It might be about having equipment available. It might be about the attractiveness of the space. Is the space conducive to learning? Again, etc., etc. It's up to you to choose a factor that you consider important to your preparation and to discuss that. Why is it important? For example, how would you consider it? How would you prepare in relation to that factor? The third category here relates to your personal preparation, how you prepare yourself for facilitation. So your factor might be to do with, do you have the knowledge? If you're going to be inputting some expert knowledge, do you have that knowledge? Do you have the facilitation skills? Are you competent? Are you prepared for what you're going to do? In a more immediate sense, what about your emotional state? Do you need to do something to adjust your emotional state? Maybe you feel you need to know more about the learners. Maybe knowing about those learners gives you confidence and will enhance your facilitation. So whatever it is, whatever factor you choose, and these are just examples, you think of your own 3 factors, you need to discuss them. And in that discussion, as mentioned there, you might consider why that factor is important and how you would prepare in relation to that factor. That's question 1, and that meets assessment criteria 1.1. Moving on to question 2. Question 2 asks that we explain 3 principles that will guide our selection of learning resources or materials to support our learning activities. So in the previous question, we considered preparation in terms of preparing learners, preparing the physical space, and preparing ourselves. And now we're thinking about preparation in relation to the learning resources or materials that we would select and prepare for our facilitation. By principles, you might be considering principles around relevance, perhaps accessibility, validity, engagement, etc., etc. There are many, but it's for you to select 3 principles that are relevant, that you find relevant, and that resonate for you. You then need to explain your principles, and this is a great place to bring in wider reading. And in that explanation, to bring out how that principle would guide your selection of resources. Also a great place to use examples. You can show in your example how that principle has informed the materials you would choose. So you could give some examples of materials there. So that's question 2, and that meets assessment criteria 1.2. Question 3. Question 3 asks us to discuss the concept of facilitation along with 2 ethical factors that we as practitioners should be aware of when we're facilitating group-based learning. A hint here that whenever you see the term concept, it usually means bringing some wider reading. And there are certainly many definitions, interpretations, some theory around this concept of facilitation. So you are initially discussing that concept, bringing in your understanding, your definition of what facilitation means, whilst also referencing what others think and possibly illustrating some of that with examples of what facilitation can be. When it comes to the ethical factors, again, there's lots of things to think about here, lots of writing on the ethics of facilitation. Areas you might consider, for example, are the power balance within facilitation. You might consider the relationship between the facilitator and the learner, or between learner and learner. You might consider aspects such as groupthink and group behaviours. Your reading will inform what you write there. As mentioned, there is plenty of writing around that subject, lots around ethics of facilitation for you to reference within your answer. That's question 3, and that meets assessment criteria 2.1. Question 4. We're now moving into quite practical thinking, and we're thinking about 4 different facilitation methods or techniques that you could use to support learning in a group context. So first of all, don't get hung up on what's a technique and what's a method. Take those as a combined thing. Doesn't matter whether it's a technique or a method, and people would define them differently anyway. So you're taking 4 techniques or methods and explaining them and how you would use them. So there are many, many methods and techniques we use in facilitation, and it could be anything from opening activities to inputting content, to supporting group discussion, to managing reflecting activities. It could be closing activities. It might be things you do to support engagement. It could be anything within facilitation, any techniques or methods, perhaps ones that you particularly like or you feel you can talk about. And you're asked to explain those 4, including how you would use them. So you're showing your ability to apply, although you're just writing about it here. You're showing that you have the knowledge about how to use techniques and methods to support learning in a group context. So remember, this is in a group context. That's question 4, and that responds to assessment criteria 2.2. Question 5. Question 5 asks you to discuss 2 techniques for monitoring the effectiveness of learning activities during facilitation and 2 real-time adjustments you might make to enhance the learning process. This should be for 1 or more learners where your monitoring identifies a need for this. So that's quite a wordy question there, and let's just unpick it because it's a question that people often misunderstand. So we're talking about techniques for monitoring the effectiveness of learning. But what we're not talking about here is evaluation after learning has taken place. This isn't about evaluation. This is about the real-time monitoring of learning whilst it is taking place. So it's monitoring the effectiveness of learning activities during facilitation. So this is looking at you as the facilitator in a facilitation, during your facilitation, looking around, being aware and thinking, are the people in the group getting what they need from this facilitation? Maybe they're not. Maybe you might recognize that some are alienated, some are not engaged, some are not learning. And so how are you going to do that? How are you going to monitor the effectiveness of that learning? It's not good enough just to wait till the end and then say, was that great for everyone? It's not about that. It's about you as the facilitator using the skills of monitoring learning whilst it's taking place. So in that green box, we're asking you to discuss, again, you can bring in what others say, bring in some reading, discuss techniques for monitoring the effectiveness of learning during facilitation. And remember, this is a group. We're not talking about one-to-one coaching here. We're talking about group facilitation. So 2 techniques for monitoring people within a group. How are they learning? How effective is the learning? The second half of that, still within the facilitation, now asks you to consider, okay, so you're monitoring learning. You've noticed that some individuals within the group, maybe the whole group, aren't engaging or aren't learning. So what real-time adjustments, what adjustments can you make there and then to enhance the learning process? And again, just to emphasize, this is not about after the learning, when you tweak your session, program, whatever, to make it different. This is about things you actually do during the facilitation. So what can you do during that facilitation if people are not engaged or not learning or don't seem happy in the process? What can you do to enhance that? And it might be about changing around activities, it might be about changing around materials, it might be about the way you include, the way you actually use your skills to bring people in. But it's up to you. Again, another fascinating subject and a real skill, and this is the skill of facilitation, actually being aware and being able to manage and enable during the facilitation. So a good question there, question 5, one you can really think about and write about, bring in what other people say, and that question, meets AC Assessment Criteria 2.3. Question 6. Question 6 is one of the next 3 questions that are concerned with transfer of learning. And it would be a good idea to read all 3 questions, question 6, question 7 and question 8, just so that you don't end up writing an enormous amount of material in question 6 that then leaves you with not much to write in question 7 and question 8. So look at those 3 questions before you attempt question 6 and think about what works best in which response. So question 6 is about the underpinning theory of transfer of learning. And as you can see there, it asks you to explain the concept of transfer of learning and its significance in workplace learning. We did mention earlier that whenever you see the term concept, that usually means bring in some wider reading. So whilst we do want to know what you think and what you understand by transfer of learning, how you would define it, it's also a great place to bring in what others have said, written about this concept. Many people have thought about, talked about, and written about the concept of transfer of learning. So explain the concept first of all, and either within that explanation or as a follow-on from it, talk about the significance of transfer to workplace learning. And you can't really overemphasize the significance. It's really for you to express your judgment, why you think transfer of learning is important. Again, you can bring in different ideas about what other people have said. And it might also be a great place to bring in some examples. You could exemplify what you mean by good transfer of learning. Maybe where transfer doesn't take place, you might have examples of that. So you're talking here quite theoretically about the concept using reference to some wider reading and examples to bring your thinking to life, to show that you understand that concept and its significance to a workplace context. So that's question 6, which meets assessment criteria 3.1. Question 7. As mentioned, question 7 extends this idea of transfer of learning into a further question. So the question here states, first of all, that there are various strategies available to support the transfer of learning. That's the transfer of learning from a learning event back to the workplace. And examples of this include action planning, work-based projects, and action learning sets. The question then asks you to evaluate the use of 2 of these 3 examples. Before we unpick that question a little bit more, let's just mention that sentence in red font. This is one of those questions, one of those assessment criteria, where there is no requirement to include evidence of wider reading. You can just focus on your thinking, the facts, the practicalities of this question. So getting back to that question, you're asked to take 2 of those 3 examples and evaluate the use of them. So assuming that you take action planning, the first one, as one of your 2, you should perhaps begin by explaining what we mean by action planning as a strategy for supporting transfer of learning. And then to evaluate that strategy, to evaluate what works well about action planning, what might be the pitfalls, what might be the weaknesses, what might be the problems in action planning. So it's an evaluation, but it would make good sense to explain the strategy before you evaluate it. You then need a second example from that 3, and the same again. We would recommend that you explain what you understand by that strategy, whether it's work-based projects or action learning sets, whichever is your second strategy, and then evaluate what works well about that, what might be the weaknesses, the pitfalls, potential problems of that strategy. So that's question 7. So question 8 takes us further into this concept of transfer of learning, And whilst we've looked at some of the theory of transfer of learning and some of the strategies that can be used to support transfer of learning, we're now looking at some of the roles involved. And question 8 asks us to evaluate the role of line managers in supporting transfer of learning for their team and the role learning and development professionals can play in supporting line managers to do this. So 2 parts to that question. I would take them separately and look first of all at line managers and maybe begin by explaining the role of line managers in supporting transfer for their team. How might line managers do this? Give examples. But also, because you have the command verb evaluate, it's important that you actually look at the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of that role. Is it a valid role for a line manager? What's good about it? What could work well? What could be the pitfalls of the line manager having a role in supporting transfer? So remember that command verb, evaluate. So it's not just about explaining the role, you should also evaluate the role of line managers. Is it an important role? The second part of the question, as we mentioned, is about the role L&D and L&D professionals can play in supporting the line managers to actually support transfer of learning. So you're supporting the line managers to transfer learning for their team. So again, you might explain how L&D could support line managers here, maybe give examples, but don't forget that command verb. Because you're being asked to evaluate, you also need to bring in that evaluation. Is it a valid role? What works well about it? Is it important that L&D do this? What are the potential weaknesses, pitfalls? Are there any potential problems? So that's the last question on transfer of learning, and it's actually the last question in task 1. So that's question 8. That supports assessment criteria 3.3. When you have finished your response to question 8, it's likely that you have now completed task 1. So to be sure of that, just refer back to the instructions that to complete the task, you should provide a written response to 8 questions. So make sure that you have responded to all 8 questions and that you have done that in approximately 2,800 words, give or take that 10%. It's also important that you've taken note of this further instruction here and that you have made use of wider reading within your answers and that has been accurately referenced. When you're happy that you have done all that and done it to your satisfaction, then you should be ready to move on to task 2. Task 2, facilitation. We said at the beginning of this webinar that there will be 2 tasks and that the first task would assess your knowledge and understanding of the topic, but that the second task would assess your application of your knowledge and understanding of the topic, in this case facilitation. So the task, as it says here, assesses your ability to facilitate face-to-face, in-person, group-based learning and development activity that is inclusive and that meets objectives. So it is about application, and as you would expect for a qualification in this subject at this level, you are required to have carried out some facilitation or to carry out some facilitation to meet the requirements of the unit. The instructions for task 2 are that in order to complete this task, you are required to have facilitated at least one learning activity, and that learning activity must meet the following requirements. So you're required to facilitate at least one learning activity, and that activity must be face-to-face, in person. It must be for a group of learners, i.e. 3 or more learners. It must, as stated, be for at least 1 hour duration, and it must involve some of those facilitation strategies or techniques that you would use to ensure the activity is inclusive. And of course, it must address specific learning objectives. It must have a purpose and address that purpose. So let's just unpick those instructions a little bit more just to help with planning. Well, the main instruction, the main criteria, and the crunch of this whole activity is that your facilitation meets the 5 stated criteria. They're the ones we've just gone through on the previous slide and that are stated there on the right hand of this slide. So the facilitation must be face-to-face, must be for a group of learners, must be of at least 1 hour, must involve those techniques, and must address specific learning objectives. That's the main thing. The facilitation activity must meet those criteria. Secondly, so that you can usefully and genuinely reflect on that facilitation, the activity does need to be reasonably current. CIPD has therefore stated that there should be no more than 6 months between the date of your facilitation activity and the date you submit your work, your assignment, for assessment. So no more than 6 months between the facilitation activity and your submission for assessment of this assignment. And thirdly, whilst ideally your facilitation would take place in a work context, this might not be possible for everyone. And so it's equally valid to consider other contexts. You might consider voluntary work, sports groups, social groups, community groups, other valid contexts. I strongly recommend though here that before you start anything, you agree that context with your assessor or centre so that everyone knows what's going to happen and there are no surprises when you submit your assignment. Having carried out your facilitation, you then need to provide evidence of this for your assignment. The main piece of evidence for this unit is a reflection from you, your reflection on your facilitation and how it met those 5 criteria. Those criteria that we've mentioned several times and are noted there. So your reflection should include a short explanation or confirmation about how your facilitation met the first 3 criteria here. That shouldn't take up many words. You just need to tell us about the context. Was it face-to-face? Well, it had to be face-to-face, but how was it face-to-face? What was the purpose? Who were the learners? How many were there? And what was the overall duration of your session? So a brief explanation about how your facilitation meets the first 3 of those criteria. The majority of your words, however, should be used for a deeper reflection on how you met the last 2 criteria, how you applied your knowledge and understanding of facilitation to this activity. So, for example, you might reflect on the strategies or techniques you used in your facilitation. How did you seek to make it inclusive? Did you monitor inclusivity? Did you make any adjustments to ensure everyone was engaged? How did you do this? Were they successful? And what were the objectives of your session? How did you intend to meet these? Did you meet these? How do you know if you met them or not? So we're looking for a rich, in-depth reflection on your facilitation and how effective it was in relation to those 5 criteria. Remember, your reflection is the most important piece of evidence here. It's the piece of evidence that demonstrates your competence in this task to your assessor. It's just worth noting, just a reminder, that 2.4, which is what this activity is about, is one of the criteria that don't require any reference to wider reading. So there's no need to make academic reference within your reflection. It's all about your knowledge and your honest reflection on your facilitation. However, there is a requirement for a second piece of evidence here, And this evidence is direct evidence to confirm that you have facilitated, that your facilitation has taken place, and to tell us a little bit about it, particularly how it met those 5 criteria. The format of this second piece of evidence, which should be agreed with your centre in advance, can come from one of the following 3 categories as listed there. So first of all, it may be that your facilitation can be observed by a tutor and that your tutor can provide an observation record, confirming your facilitation and commenting on how it met the 5 criteria. So an observation from a tutor is the first and possibly most straightforward category. Secondly, if your facilitation was undertaken in your workplace, your evidence could be a detailed testimony from a workplace manager, confirming your facilitation and again commenting on the 5 criteria. If you happen to carry out your facilitation in a non-workplace context that was agreed between you and your centre, then the testimony can be from another person in an appropriate role or position, again agreed between you and your study centre in advance of the facilitation. So someone who's in an appropriate role in that community group, sports group, volunteer context, etc. So that's the second category. And thirdly, you can provide a video extract of your facilitation. So it must be a minimum of 20 minutes, and as much as possible, try within that extract to choose something that reflects some of that 5 stated criteria. At least it should confirm that you have facilitated a face-to-face group learning activity and that it did involve some facilitation techniques to ensure inclusivity and/or address objectives. And whilst it might only be an extract, it should be evident as much as possible that this is just an extract of a longer, minimum 1 hour, facilitated session. It's probably important to mention here as well that it is your, i.e. the learner's, responsibility to source this testimony or provide the video rather than expecting your assessor or your centre to chase this up or get hold of it for you. And again, just to emphasise, as in the last slide, that 2.4, which is what this activity is about, is one of those criteria that do not require any reference to wider academic reading. It's just about submitting the required evidence as detailed here. When you've completed task 2 and of course task 1, you should have some evidence from your work, 3 items of evidence, and they must consist of, for task 1, written responses to each of the 8 set questions. And remember, that must be within 2,800 words, give or take that 10%. So that's task 1, just written responses to your questions. And for task 2, your written reflection, which also has a word count. You have approximately 1,100 words to complete that reflection. And with that, we would also like some direct evidence of your facilitation, something that confirms that you have facilitated, and that evidence can take any of the 3 types of evidence described in the slide above. And of course, that second item of evidence would not be included in your word count. So when you have all of that and you've completed that evidence and provided that evidence to the best of your ability, you have completed task 1 and task 2. Just a little bit of guidance before we finalise the webinar. Things to think about in all your assignments are that you read all the instructions carefully and read them in advance. Remember to get that big picture before you start. Always respond clearly and directly to the questions. We do sometimes find that learners waste quite a lot of words writing about something that is irrelevant to the question. When you do have a limit on these words, there's a lot of questions to get into that word count. So make sure you respond directly to the question. Make sure your responses are easily accessible to your tutor or assessor, that we can see which question, which assessment criteria you're responding to. So you might do something like example 1 there, where you show the question above your response as a kind of subheading. Or you might choose something more redacted like the example below. It doesn't matter as long as you make it very clear which question you're responding to. We would always encourage you to include the AC reference, as that always helps us know what you're responding to and that you realise that there are assessment criteria there and that they all have to be addressed. Remember the thing that we've talked about a lot in this webinar, to include evidence of wider academic reading, show that you have read around your subject, refer to other people's thinking as well as your own, and finally, just make sure you comply with those evidence and word count requirements. So when you've taken all that on board and completed task 1 and task 2, your assignment should be complete. Couple of admin things though just to think about, and they are that, have you added your name and learner number? Is it clear on your assignment who you are and who wrote the assignment? Your name and learner number should be there. Have you proofread the assignment? Have you provided a clear layout, back to those subheadings and AC refs? Have you complied with word count? So just check it before you finish. And finally, and this is particularly important, make sure you submit your assignment on time. When you have complied with all of that, everything we've talked about here, you will have completed your assignment. Well done. And at this point in the webinar, you have now reached the end of the webinar. So thank you for staying with us. We do hope you found it helpful. And if so, please note that there are recorded webinars for other units within the CIPD suite of qualifications, and certainly for the 3 pathway units within the CIPD Associate Diploma in Organisational Learning and Development. Thank you.